Imagine pulling into a gas station, seeing prices drop, and feeling that instant relief in your wallet. But why do those numbers change so much? And who exactly controls them? Today on Plan Life Right, we're tackling oil prices, OPEC's recent moves, and the real world impacts you face every single day. I'm Matt Floyd, and here to break it all down is your host, former economist, an institutional fixed income trader, financial advisor, and business owner, Kevin Ross.
Thanks, Matt. It's excited to dive into this today. Understanding oil isn't just about gasoline, it's about how the gears of the entire economy turn.
Kevin, let's start from the top. How exactly do oil prices affect our daily lives? I mean, obviously, we all feel it at the gas pump, but does it go deeper than that?
That goes much deeper, Matt. Think of oil prices as the heartbeat of the global economy. When prices rise, transportation costs soar, which affects everything from groceries to airline tickets, even your next Amazon order. So it's kind of like dominoes. Once the oil price tips, everything else follows. Let's take a look at groceries, for example. Farmers rely heavily on diesel fuel for machinery like tractors and harvesters. So when diesel prices spike, farmers' operational costs they skyrocket, which makes the basic foods like milk, eggs, bread, and produce that much more expensive. So the higher fuel costs, it gives a ripple effect through the entire distribution chain from, farm to warehouse to grocery store shelves. If we look at manufacturing, another sector, that also is deeply impacted. So products ranging from electronics to clothing, they involve components that are sourced, globally. So the higher the oil prices, they push up the cost of the raw materials, the transportation, and even the factory energy expenses, which ultimately raises the prices in the retail that we pay for.
So basically, higher oil prices can significantly impact the cost of living because nearly everything we consume involves fuel at some point.
That's exactly it. Oil prices aren't just a number on a board. They're embedded in every product and service we consume. It affects your grocery bills, your utility costs, and even the price of online deliveries arriving at your doorsteps.
We keep hearing about OPEC, but Kevin, let's dive deeper. Who exactly are they, and how did they come to hold such an influence over global oil markets?
So OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was established back in 1960. And the key founding members, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Venezuela, which collectively recognized they had strength in numbers. So before OPEC was formed, oil producing nations had limited control over their resources. They're often dominated by, major oil corporations from, the United States. And OPEC, when it initially formed, it gave the countries greater power in negotiations on, over their own resource, which allowed them to collectively manage oil productions as well as pricing. So if we look at it, this way, imagine if all the coffee shops here in Tampa decided together how much coffee they're going to brew each day. They could control the prices by collectively increasing or decreasing supply. And OPEC kind of functions similarly to that.
So, McDonald's, Starbucks, Tim Horton, White Duck, all the coffee shops, they all call each other in the morning and say, "Listen, we're making 200 gallons, and
Right.
whatever they're willing to pay for it is what we're gonna get. And then tomorrow, maybe we'll do 100 gallons, and Friday we'll do 500."
Yeah, or maybe it's just the coffee shop. So the Starbucks and the whatever bean and the other ones that are around, they're the kind of the conglomerate because they're just
Right,
in
right.
the coffee business primarily. You got the outsource, the little ones, the McDonald's, but you're not going to McDonald's, I think, to buy their coffee.
No,
It's horrendous
you
in
get
my
it while you're
opinion.
there, you're not going
You
there for
get exactly.
it.
So, but yeah, to your point.
So they're kinda like, kind of like a drug cartel almost, and the world is hooked on what they have.
Yeah, yeah. We need it to
Well,
operate, right?
what was it like? Because I'm a little younger than you. What was it like before OPEC?
Well, I wasn't alive before OPEC, so
Oh,
thank you
okay.
very
Oh,
much.
okay.
Wow, that was a smack right there, wasn't it? So back before OPEC, prices fluctuated widely, so I've read, mostly dictated by, international corporations. And then the post OPEC, these nations gained significant control.
Mhm.
So for as long as I can remember, they were always controlling the cost of gas. But the key here is they can either stabilize the prices or intentionally destabilize the prices,
Right.
which was what we saw going on under the prior administration. And so through these prices, they actually coordinate their production adjustments. So they either say we're going to do produce more, which means oil prices and gas will drop, or they'll produce less, which then causes the prices to go
So they
up.
kinda just play with supply and demand, basically on a whim
Yeah.
almost, it seems.
Yeah, and I think what's happening now is because the current administration said we're going back to allowing fracking and we're going to produce our own. That now puts a strain on the OPEC nations. So the only way we're going to buy theirs is if they lower that price,
Right.
right? And now they've got the ability to lower it, below that magic, $50 a barrel, and it drops below that. That's when it kind of makes it too costly for us to produce
Right.
our own home fuel here in the United States.
So, they coordinate these production adjustments. So Venezuela jumps on the phone and they call Kuwait and say, "Hey, we're backing it down 500 barrels a day. We need you to do the same thing." And then they call Saudi Arabia and they all agree to do that all at the same time, and that's how the prices.
Yeah, in the last several years with the current regime in Venezuela, they don't have that much control. It's really Saudi Arabia is the lead
Mhm.
there, and so whatever basically Saudi Arabia says, Iran, Iraq follow, and Venezuela is like, in my opinion, the stepchild out there
Right.
that no one really likes. The U.S. can't stand Venezuela, um, and so for a while we weren't even buying Venezuelan oil. We refused it, which drove the prices down there. So and we can do that specifically with each country. So we can say, nope, we won't purchase yours. And so we put some economic constraints on that country,
Okay.
and therefore they have to either fall in line with what we want them
I gotcha.
or sell it elsewhere.
So OPEC essentially they changed the game by taking control away from the Shells and the Exxons and the Chevrons, and they placed it back into the hands of the producing countries that are producing their own materials, their
Y-
own minerals.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that they didn't have control of their own resources again, right? I mean,
Right.
it's in their land, and they're like, no, we're going to pay you $10 a barrel instead of the $40 you think it's worth.
Right.
That they were like, okay, well, we got to sell it somewhere. Back then we weren't, in the 40s, 50s, yeah, we were using cars. We weren't really going by horse and buggy anymore. But the demand wasn't there. The population here in the United States wasn't
Right.
there. And, we kind of led that, you know, the auto industry and the manufacturing of that. So it all came from us. So we were at that time, the country that was really
Right.
kind of leading the way, us and
The
you know,
Shell is bigger than Saudi Arabia,
that's right.
but OPEC is way bigger than Shell.
Yeah, well, they control all the rights, right? It's on their land. Um, if you look at the decisions that they make today, there's a ripple effect, not only here in the United States, but through the economies worldwide, which it impacts everything from global politics to the consumer's everyday spending.
Well, Kevin, we've touched on global oil dynamics, but let's bring the focus home. How much oil is the U.S. currently producing, and do we have the capacity to produce more?
Yeah, well, as of late 2024, the U.S. actually had increased their production up to around 13.4 barrels of million barrels per day. Um, and the projections are to slightly increase 3.5, 3.6 barrels per day here in 2025. So I think the majority, I want to point this, the majority of the production um, of the 13.4 million barrels per day comes from the lower 48 states, particularly in the Permian Basin, which alone accounted for 6.3 million barrels per day in 2024.
Most of the oil still comes from Texas.
Yeah, West Texas and East New Mexico is that Permian basis. So we have the geological capacity to produce more, but several factors influence potential there.
So with such high production levels, why does the U.S. still import oil? Wouldn't it be more straightforward to use our own resources and reduce dependency on OPEC? If I can grow my own tomatoes at home, why am I letting publics dictate how much they cost?
Yeah, well, it's a common misconception that all crude oil is the same, but the U.S. predominantly produces what's called light sweet crude, which is lower in sulfur, and it's actually easier to refine into gasoline. But y- many of the U.S. refineries, especially those along the Gulf Coast, they're configured to process the heavier sour crude oils that come from the Middle East. And so these heavier crude oils are they're more challenging to refine, but they also yield a different slate of
Mhm.
products like diesel fuel and jet fuel, for example. So because of this, the U.S. exports its surplus of light crude oil to other countries with refineries that are optimized for it and imports the heavier crude to match our refinery configuration. So it's a matter of economic efficiency uh, and the refinery compatibility.
Well, that makes sense, but wouldn't reconfiguring our refineries to process more of our own light crude reduce our reliance on imports?
Yeah, in theory, yes, but you've got to look into the retrofitting of the refineries. It's very expensive to do that, as well as time consuming. Um, so the the global oil market, it's all interconnected, right? And so the U.S. participates in this market not just for supply reasons, but also for economic and geopolitical considerations. So, for example, exporting oil can strengthen trade relationships and provide leverage in international negotiation.
So it's not just about energy independence. It's also about maintaining strategic economic positions globally.
That's exactly right. Energy policy isn't solely about self sufficiency. It's about balancing domestic needs within international strategy, economic benefits, and the realities of our infrastructure. So, as I want to point this out. We're seeing this increase in production, but in effect, we're one election away from going back and relying primarily on imports from OPEC.
Point. All right, Kevin, fracking is controversial. Can you explain in detail what fracking involves and why the Biden administration's stance impacted oil prices the way?
Yeah, certainly, Matt. Fracking or hydraulic fracturing involves injecting high pressure fluids into deep rock layers to release trapped oil and natural gas. So, under the Biden administration, numerous policies were introduced that limited new drilling leases and fracking permits, aiming to transition towards a renewable energy and reduce fossil fuel dependency. While these policies align with environmental goals, they restricted domestic energy production, which directly contributed to rising fuel prices. So if you look at lithium mining, for example, on the on electric vehicles, lithium mining is crucial for EV batteries. It's the source, right? Um, but it also carries environmental concerns, which includes, habit habitat destruction, water contamination, and massive water usage.
Yeah, and they don't mine that lithium with solar powered excavators and solar powered
Right,
mining equipment or wind powered turbines. They're
right,
using diesel powered heavy machinery out there to do this.
right, right. You got to remember wind turbine are lubricated through oil,
Exactly.
crude oil.
Yeah.
So
So you can't
you're
get
not
it.
getting
You
away
can't get
from it.
away from it if you
Exactly.
tried.
If we look at hydrogen, it's emerged as another green alternative and it's touted as clean fuel, which I think it is. But producing hydrogen efficiency often involves, you guess it, fossil fuels and that they're trying to replace. So I guess bottom line is you're not ever going to get rid of fossil fuels. You can maybe decrease the
Yeah.
demand.
Maybe not make it the only game in town for
That's right.
everything.
There'll be, I think, other
Right.
alternatives. We'll see that.
So would you say lithium and hydrogen are truly better for the environment compared to traditional fossil fuels?
Well, I think they both have significant environmental impacts. While lithium extraction raises serious ecological concerns, hydrogen production's environmental footprint largely depends on the energy source to get it there, right? So, truly green hydrogen produced from renewable energy is ideal, but it's certainly expensive. It's not widely accessible. So, I don't see that coming anytime in the near future,
Right.
especially totally all green.
And we probably would have to get it from water.
R-
So
Well, yeah,
countries
that's
that are landlocked and desert countries that don't
well,
have
you
access
got
to a
so
lot of
now you
water,
got to
they're out of the
fuel. You
mix.
got to fuel if you're going into the middle of the United States. Where are they getting that water from?
Right.
Right. So
Lakes and
you got
rivers,
to.
but that's what we're drinking it.
That's right.
So they
So
need to get it out of the oceans,
so
basically.
now all of a sudden, what the cost of water goes up because that's the demand. Same thing that California's experiencing with the surge on electric. If they totally, like they said they were going to do, get rid of all fossil fuel and tax you if you have fossil fuel cars, which they probably will, um, unless they get a newer, smarter governor in place. But think about it. If they did that, they don't have the power grid to support the amount of population that still remains in
Right.
California. So how are you going to get around? They don't have mass transit, so it doesn't add up. So that's the things you got to look at when you talk about these green energy. So I think ultimately each energy source has its trade offs, and sustainable energy policy requires balancing environmental impacts, economic practicability, and energy security. And so, again, fossil fuels aren't going to go
Right.
anywhere. Um, I think we'll have EVs. That's going to be a way of
Mhm.
the future, especially the hybrid model,
Right.
as well as I think you'll start seeing more and more hydrogen
Mhm.
cars being produced in an infrastructure. But again, that's a 15-year footprint to make it where it's sustainable from coast to coast.
Yeah, and mostly a loser for you on the investment side until year 15, where it
Yeah,
might start turning
yeah,
a
it's going to
profit.
be cost prohibitive sure, in the beginning.
We often hear about oil prices predicting economic conditions, but are they leading or lagging indicators?
Well, Matt, that's a good question. They're primarily leading indicators. Think of them as this: an economic weather forecaster. That the rising oil prices often signal inflation and economic slowdown is soon to follow. Right. So lower prices then can mean economic relief, right? So boosting spending, which can boost spending power and and actually spur economic growth there in the short term,
Right.
like what we're seeing here in the last 20 days or 15 days. Where I think here in Tampa we were paying 310, 320 a gallon. What'd you say,
Yeah,
269?
269 this morning on the way in.
269, so that's a pretty significant,
Yeah.
move here, and it had been hovering around that 320 mark for,
Right.
quite a while.
Yeah. Well, give us an example at the pump.
Well, alright, so under the previous administration, we got oil got above 120 bucks a barrel, and gas at the pump was, on average over $6 per gallon. And I think California was actually over 10. I think they had to lower you weren't actually buying a gallon of gas,
Because they
because
could
they
only put
couldn't.
999 on the
Yeah,
sign.
exactly. So it was 9.99 for 7/10 of a gallon or something like that. And then last year we saw, before election that the oil prices started dropping. We got, down around $100 a barrel. We were still paying nearly
Right.
450 a barrel on average nationwide. I think, California dropped to around 750 a gallon. So it's ridiculous, right?
Right.
And here's the thing: the media would have you believe, and we saw it all last year prior to the election, that oil prices are dropping under, the Biden administration. It was national average at 6 plus. Now it's down around 450. Um, but what they failed to mention was at the beginning of Biden's administration, the gas was actually on average
Right. Yeah,
$2.39.
we
It
haven't
was a
seen those
national
in
average,
years. Like
not
5,
since
6 years,
the
yeah.
prior administration.
Right.
That's now the current administration again. So, um, so for now, with the increased OPEC production, I think we'll see, prices dip closer to, like $3 for a national
Right.
average, in the near future anyway. So you'll see it directly impact consumer spending and consumer confidence. Um, so, you know, which is actually really the timely, place, because we're getting ready to come up here on summer vacation. We get lower prices at the pump, which means that you'll have more family
Yeah,
vacations.
vacations are
Yeah,
cheaper.
now
Yeah.
they may be able to afford Disney again because that's a, second mortgage.
Well, finally, Kevin, what's your prediction for oil prices in 2025? And what does that mean for our listeners' investment portfolios?
Well, so for 2025, what I see is a moderation in oil prices. You look around 60 to $70. I think it's going to hover around there. Um, we'll see a continuation of global production increases and some economic adjustments therein. Stable, moderate oil prices are generally positive for stocks, especially in the consumer sectors, as companies are, able to manage their cost and boost their profitability.
So it sounds like a balanced market with some opportunities for investors.
Yeah, that's right, Matt. The stability creates clarity for investors. It makes to actually make informed decisions. So as we work through the tariff impacts, it could be an even bigger boom towards Q4. But look for more volatility here in the short term along the way.
Well, Kevin, before we wrap up, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners today?
So, Matt, I think the biggest takeaway is that energy policies, prices, and choices deeply impact not only our wallets but also, our quality of life and the broader
Sure.
economy. So, oil isn't just fuel; it's the economic stability, the national security, and environmental responsibility, all wrapped into one complex issue. You know, it used it's used in just about everything that we consume each and every day.
Well, thanks, Kevin. That wraps today's deep dive into oil and OPEC. For more insights, subscribe to Plan Life Right. And don't forget Kevin's powerful books, Mastering the Art of Influence, The Customer Intelligence Guide, and Mastering the Sale of Index Universal Life Insurance. Look, if you want to increase sales or grow your business, these books are game changers.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's been my pleasure. To everyone here tuning in, stay informed, stay proactive, and most importantly, keep planning life right. And don't forget to like and subscribe.